Airports are places of movement, connection, and routine, a space where millions pass through daily, each with their own stories, destinations, and hopes. On this particular day, the terminal buzzed with its usual rhythm, families reuniting, travelers hurrying to gates, and announcements echoing overhead. But amidst this ordinary scene, one traveler's journey was about to take a jarring turn. She stood quietly, in line, clutching her boarding pass and ID, ready to clear security like everyone else. Her name was Maya, a poised and confident woman on her way to an important meeting, her focus unshaken despite the chaos around her. Yet the moment she approached the checkpoint, the air seemed to shift. A TSA officer singled her out, waving her to the side without explanation. What began as an inconvenience would soon escalate into something far more troubling. With each passing moment, the officer's actions grew more invasive, his tone sharper, his questions more pointed. Maya watched helplessly as he rifled through her belongings, pulling out clothes, personal items, and papers, scattering them carelessly across the inspection table. The glances from other passengers felt like knives, cutting into her dignity, as if she had done something wrong simply by existing. Her voice remained steady as she asked for an explanation, but her composure only seemed to irritate him further. He began dismantling her luggage piece by piece, pulling at seams and damaging items with a force that felt deliberate. Around her, murmurs of discomfort rippled through the crowd. Some whispered, some stared, but no one intervened. Maya's heart pounded not out of fear, but out of frustration. She knew what this was. She had seen it before. And yet, she stayed silent. For now. What the officer didn't know was that Maya wasn't just another passenger, and what happened next would leave everyone, especially him, questioning everything they thought they knew. Maya was no stranger to challenges, a respected civil rights lawyer. She had spent her career navigating courtrooms and advocating for those who couldn't fight for themselves. This trip was meant to be another chapter in her work, an important meeting that could influence policies affecting countless lives. Yet here she was, standing at the mercy of someone who had no idea who she was, or the impact she had on the world around her. Officer Gregg was methodical, but not in the way that instilled confidence. His actions were rushed and erratic, driven not by protocol, but by something personal, something unspoken. Maya remained calm, her eyes following his every move. Her voice steady as she asked, "Is there a reason my belongings are being handled like this?" Gregg barely glanced at her, muttering something vague about standard procedure. His tone was dismissive, his demeanor cold. To him, Maya was just another inconvenience, another passenger he could dominate under the guise of security. This wasn't the first time he had let his personal biases dictate his actions. For years, Gregg had operated on a distorted sense of authority, fueled by his frustrations and insecurities. Today, Maya was his target. The line of passengers at the checkpoint grew longer as the scene unfolded. Some watched with curiosity, others with discomfort. A mother pulled her child closer, shielding them from the tension. A businessman shifted his weight impatiently, glancing at his watch, and yet no one spoke up. Gregg's hands moved to Maya's suitcase, a sleek black hardshell case. Without warning, he yanked at the zipper, tearing it open with unnecessary force. Her neatly packed items spilled out. A carefully folded blazer, a pair of shoes, and a stack of documents that fluttered to the ground. He rummaged through her belongings, pulling out each item as if searching for something incriminating, something that would justify his actions. Maya bent down to retrieve her papers, but Gregg's voice cut through the air. "Leave it," he barked, his tone sharp and unyielding. For a moment, Maya froze. She wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially not in such a public setting. Slowly, she straightened up, her hands at her sides, her expression calm but unyielding. "These are confidential documents," she said evenly. "If you're going to search them, I'd like a supervisor present." Gregg scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "You don't make the rules here," he snapped. His voice carried an edge of authority, but it lacked the professionalism that should have accompanied his position. It was clear to everyone watching that this was no longer about security. This was personal. Passengers began to murmur, their whispers filling the space like a low hum. One man pulled out his phone, discreetly recording the scene. Another leaned toward his companion, muttering, "This doesn't seem right." But the crowd remained a silent witness, unwilling or unsure of how to intervene. Maya's frustration grew, but she refused to let it show. She knew that any outburst, any sign of anger, could be used against her. Years of experience had taught her the delicate balance required in moments like these. Her voice remained calm as she repeated her request, "Please call your supervisor." Greg ignored her. Instead, he picked up her bag and began shaking it, forcing its remaining contents onto the table. Jewelry clattered against the metal surface. A framed photo of Maya and her husband tumbled out, the glass cracking on impact. Maya's eyes flickered to the photo, her heart tightening at the sight. It was then that Greg made his mistake. He grabbed her laptop, a sleek silver device with a protective case, and slammed it onto the table with unnecessary force. The sound echoed through the terminal, drawing the attention of even those who had tried to ignore the scene. Maya's composure finally cracked. "That's enough," she said firmly, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even the murmurs around her. "I've asked for a supervisor, and I have every right to one." Greg smirked, his confidence unshaken. "And I have every right to search your belongings," he shot back, his tone dripping with condescension. He leaned closer, his voice lowering as he added, "Unless you've got something to hide." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Maya held his gaze, her eyes unwavering. She didn't respond, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she knew her silence would speak louder than any words. Then, from the corner of her eye, Maya saw him. Her husband, David, striding toward the checkpoint with a look of quiet determination. He had arrived just in time, and the balance of power was about to shift in a way Greg could never have anticipated. David's approach was purposeful, his movements measured. He didn't rush, didn't shout. His demeanor alone commanded attention. Dressed in a tailored blazer and with the confident stride of someone used to authority, his presence was unmistakable. Passengers began to glance between him and Maya, wondering if this new figure would intervene. Yet, David's arrival didn't seem to register with Officer Greg, who was too consumed by his actions to notice the shift in the atmosphere. Greg had crossed a line. He wasn't just searching now, he was dismantling. Maya's toiletries were emptied onto the table, some rolling to the floor. A scarf she had received as a gift lay crumpled and torn. Greg's gloved hands moved without care or consideration, his expression hard and dismissive. Every action he took seemed to carry an unspoken message. "You don't belong here." Maya remained composed, though her frustration was evident in the slight tightening of her jaw. She didn't lash out. She knew better than to give Greg the reaction he might have been seeking. Instead, she leaned forward slightly and said, her voice calm but cutting, "You're violating my rights, and I'm going to hold you accountable for every item you've damaged." Greg's eyes flickered briefly, but he quickly masked his reaction with an exaggerated smirk. "Ma'am," he replied, his tone mocking, "this is a routine security check. You're the one making it difficult." His words were a trigger. A passenger nearby, a woman clutching a toddler, turned to her partner and whispered loud enough for others to hear, "That's not routine. He's going too far." A man with a backpack took out his phone and began recording more openly now, his camera trained on the officer's every move. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, but Greg remained oblivious, focusing instead on a new tactic. "You're being uncooperative, sir." His voice projected projecting over the crowd as if to preemptively justify his actions. "If you don't comply, I'll have to call for additional security." The statement hung in the air, heavy with its implied threat. Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Call them," she replied evenly. "I'll be happy to explain my position to them as well." Greg hesitated. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He wasn't used to this level of calm defiance, and it threw him off balance. But instead of de-escalating, he doubled down, grabbing a nearby walkie-talkie and muttering something into it. Around them, the tension grew. The passengers watching were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses, their phones capturing every word, every action. A child asked their parent, "Why is he being so mean to her?" The parent shushed the child, but their eyes never left the scene. David stopped just short of the inspection area, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene before him. He took in the sight of Maya's belongings scattered across the table and floor, the TSA officer looming over her, and the uneasy crowd surrounding them. His jaw tightened, but like Maya, he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stepped forward and spoke with a calm authority that cut through the noise. "What seems to be the problem here, Satri? Steady and clear." Greg finally looked up, his expression hardening as he sized David up. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," he replied curtly, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. "Please step back." David didn't move. His gaze didn't waver. "That's my wife you're speaking to," he said evenly, each word deliberate. "And it looks like there's a serious issue here." Greg's demeanor shifted slightly, but he quickly recovered, his tone growing defensive. "Your wife has been flagged for additional screening," he said, gesturing to the disarray on the table as if it were self-explanatory. "She's refusing to cooperate." Maya's voice broke through the exchange. "That's a lie," she said firmly, addressing not just Greg, but the crowd around them. "I've complied with every request. What I haven't done is accept this treatment as normal." "I require for stir," so David's eyes moved to the scattered items on the table, then back to Greg. "You're destroying her belongings," he said calmly. "Is that part of your procedure too?" Greg faltered. The crowd had grown silent, their attention focused entirely on the confrontation. Someone in the back whispered, "That guy's not messing around." Another murmured, "He looks like he means business." David took a step closer, his presence undeniable. "What's your name, officer?" he asked, his tone still calm but with an edge of authority that couldn't be ignored. Greg hesitated. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but then closed it again, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Before he could regain control of the situation, a voice interrupted them from the side. "What's going on here?" It was the supervisor, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. She approached quickly, her eyes darting between Greg, Maya, and David. The crowd shifted, their whispers dying down as they waited to see what would happen next. Maya didn't wait for Greg to explain. She turned to the supervisor, her voice calm but resolute. "This officer has mishandled my belongings, damaged my property, and accused me of being uncooperative without cause. I've asked for your presence multiple times." The supervisor's expression darkened as she looked at the table, the scattered items, the cracked photo frame. Her gaze turned to Greg, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. "Is this true?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I see Pfeiffer." David cut him off. "No," he said firmly, his voice commanding. "You weren't. And now you're going to explain yourself." The supervisor raised a hand, signaling for silence. "We'll handle this," she said briskly. She turned to Maya. "I'll personally make sure this is addressed. Please accept my apologies for the inconvenience." David's expression didn't soften. He stepped closer to the supervisor, his voice low, but unmistakably clear. "This isn't just an inconvenience," he said. "This is a violation, and it's going to have consequences." The crowd murmured in agreement, their phones still recording, their expressions ranging from shock to quiet approval. It was clear that this moment wasn't just about Maya anymore. It had become a stand against something much larger. The supervisor's face was tense as she took in the scene before her, the scattered belongings, the visibly frustrated Maya, the crowd of onlookers, and the silent yet commanding presence of David. All of it painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. Her gaze shifted back to Officer Gregg, who now looked less certain, his previous bravado noticeably diminished. David was the first to break the silence. His voice was calm, steady, yet impossible to dismiss. "I believe this situation has gone far beyond standard procedure," he said, locking eyes with the supervisor. "What's happening here isn't just unprofessional. It's unacceptable." The supervisor nodded curtly, her focus now squarely on Gregg. "What's your explanation for this?" she demanded. Her tone wasn't angry, but it carried an expectation of accountability that made the officer shift uncomfortably. Gregg's response was halting, his words no longer carrying the certainty they had before. She was flagged for additional screening," he said, his voice lacking the authority he had so forcefully used earlier. "Her reactions raised some concerns, and I was just doing my job." David's sharp laugh cut through the tension. It wasn't loud or mocking, but it was enough to draw every eye in the room. "Your job?" he repeated, his voice dripping with restrained disbelief. "I'm curious, does your job include damaging personal property, or is it standard practice to intimidate passengers and ignore their rights?" The supervisor's lips tightened, and she stepped forward. "Officer Gregg," she said sharply, "did you follow proper protocol in this screening?" Her words were precise, almost surgical, as if she were dissecting the situation piece by piece. Gregg stammered again, his confidence crumbling. I follow the standard procedures for flagged passengers," he said weakly, avoiding eye contact. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He swiped through it briefly before holding it out for the supervisor to see. "This," he said, "is a list of federal guidelines for TSA procedures. I'm fairly certain you'll find that none of them include this level of disrespect or the destruction of property." The supervisor glanced at the phone, her face hardening further. She turned to Maya. "I need to sincerely apologize for this," she said, her voice earnest. "This is not how we operate, and I will personally ensure this matter is addressed." Maya inclined her head slightly, her composure still intact, despite everything that had transpired. "I appreciate your acknowledgement," she said, her voice firm but polite. "But an apology isn't enough. I need to know what steps will be taken to prevent this from happening again, to me or to anyone else." The supervisor nodded, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. "I understand," she said. "We'll investigate this thoroughly, and appropriate action will be taken." Gregg opened his mouth as if to protest, but the supervisor silenced him with a look. "You've done enough," she said coldly. "You're relieved of your duties for the remainder of the day. I'll be reviewing your actions personally." The officer's face turned pale, and for the first time he looked truly shaken. His bravado was gone, replaced by a dawning realization of the consequences he now faced. He muttered something inaudible before stepping away, his movements slow and reluctant. The tension in the room began to shift. The crowd, which had been silent observers, now murmured in hushed tones. Some nodded in approval, others whispered among themselves. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment. David turned to Maya, his expression softening. He reached out and gently took her hand, a quiet reassurance that the worst was over. Maya looked at him, her gratitude unspoken but clear in her eyes. But David wasn't finished. He turned back to the supervisor, his voice steady yet commanding. "You'll also be hearing from us directly," he said. "My wife is a civil rights attorney, and I think you'll agree this incident warrants more than an internal review." The supervisor didn't flinch. "You're absolutely right," she said. "I'll make sure our legal team is ready to work with you on this." As the situation began to resolve, the crowd slowly dispersed, but not before many passengers approached Maya and David to express their support. Some shook their hands, others simply offered kind words, but all of them left with a renewed awareness of what they had just witnessed. The footage recorded by bystanders soon found its way online, sparking widespread discussion about racial profiling and accountability in airport security. The incident became a catalyst for change, prompting investigations and new training protocols aimed at preventing similar situations in the future. For Greg, the fallout was swift. An internal review uncovered a pattern of misconduct in his previous screenings, leading to his dismissal. For Maya and David, the incident became a reminder of why they continue to fight for justice and fairness, not just in courtrooms, but in everyday life. As they walked away from the checkpoint, David placed a reassuring hand on Maya's shoulder. "You handled that with more grace than I would have," he said with a small smile. Maya returned the smile, her voice steady, as she replied, "We didn't come this far to let ignorance win." In the days following the incident, the footage captured by bystanders spread rapidly, sparking outrage across social media and news platforms. Headlines questioned the integrity of airport security procedures, and thousands of Yokers shared their own stories of bias and discrimination. What happened to Maya was no longer just a personal experience. It had become a flashpoint in the ongoing conversation about systemic prejudice in everyday spaces. The airport, under immense public pressure, issued a formal apology. The statement expressed regret for the actions of Officer Gregg and assured the public that an immediate investigation was underway. But for many, including Maya and David, words weren't enough. Concrete action was needed. Maya, drawing on her expertise as a civil rights lawyer, worked tirelessly to channel the incident into meaningful change. She filed an official complaint, not only to address her personal grievances, but to demand a comprehensive review of TSA policies and practices. Her demand wasn't just for accountability, but for tangible reforms, better training, clearer protocols, and safeguards against unchecked authority. For Officer Gregg, the consequences were swift. An internal investigation revealed a troubling pattern of complaints against him, many citing racial bias and unprofessional conduct. Within weeks, he was removed from his position, a decision the TSA framed as part of their commitment to restoring public trust. But Maya knew this was just one piece of the larger issue. In an interview with a national news outlet, she spoke directly to the heart of the matter. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident," she said. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. We need accountability, but we also need education. We need to break down the biases that lead to these situations before they happen." Her words resonated with millions, sparking discussions in homes, offices, and classrooms across the country. Advocacy groups reached out, inviting Maya to collaborate on broader initiatives. She accepted, determined to turn her personal ordeal into a catalyst for change. Meanwhile, David's role as a community leader amplified the impact of their message. At a town hall meeting, he shared his perspective, his voice filled with both passion and resolve. "What happened to my wife wasn't just an insult. It was a reminder of how much work we still have to do. This is about dignity. This is about respect. And this is about ensuring that no one has to go through what she did." As the couple continued their advocacy, the airport implemented new training programs designed to address implicit bias and improve passenger interactions. The programs, which included input from Maya and other experts, became a model for other airports nationwide. Maya and David's journey didn't end with the reforms. They continued to push for systemic change, speaking at conferences and working with lawmakers to advocate for stronger oversight and accountability in public institutions. Yet, for all their public efforts, they never lost sight of the personal impact of the incident. In a quiet moment at home, Maya and David reflected on the events that had unfolded. Sitting at their dining table, surrounded by documents and notes from their advocacy work, they shared a rare pause in their busy lives. "Do you ever wish we didn't have to fight these battles?" David asked, his voice low but thoughtful. Maya looked at him, her expression calm yet determined. "Every day," she admitted. "But if we don't, who will? It's not just about standing up for ourselves, it's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. That's the only way things will change." Their story is more than a confrontation. It's a testament to the power of resilience, advocacy, and the pursuit of justice. Maya and David turned a moment of humiliation into a movement for accountability, reminding us all that standing up against prejudice isn't just a personal act. It's a collective responsibility. Have you ever experienced or witnessed injustice? What did you do in that moment, and what do you wish you could have done? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together we can bring attention to the changes that still need to be made. Thanks for watching. Let's keep this conversation going. Share this video with your friends and family to spread awareness about the challenges of racial profiling and the importance of standing up for justice. Let's work together to create a system that values dignity, respect, and fairness for everyone. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience, justice, and change. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Together, we can make a difference.